Good evening, everybody. How's everybody doing tonight? Good? All right, well, welcome. My name is Chris Kocher. I am the director of Wealthy Theater. Really grateful to have you all here tonight. Thank you for being here. I am here to welcome you all to the 2024 Grand Rapids Mayoral Debate. Tonight is a collaboration between multiple programs of the Grand Rapids Community Media Center. And if you don't know, GRCMC is a nonprofit organization where for over 40 years has been dedicated to connecting the community through media. And with that, we do it in a variety of ways: independent community radio, WYCE, there is a web development services team, there's a media production services team. Of course, here at Wealthy Theater, we connect the community through live events. And we're especially grateful for this one as a collaboration with the Rapidian and GRTV. Civic engagement is really important right now. I want to give a special shout out to the Rapidian, which for the last year and a half has been doing some incredible work at a time more than ever. We really need this kind of engagement of informing the community and connecting the community with local and civic engagement and local community government. So shout out to the Rapidian for that great work. You could have done this debate anywhere, and we're really grateful to have you here. So thanks for being here. Appreciate you. So I want to welcome the moderators for tonight's event. And I also want to thank some partners real quick. Thank you to the partners for this event: GVSU Votes, City of Grand Rapids Clerk's Office, the League of Women Voters of the Greater Grand Rapids area, and the Rapidian and GRTV are all tabling out in the lobby right now. If you're interested in learning more about them, please visit the table and go talk to them, some great community resources. And thank you to the host for the event tonight, the Rapidian, and GRTV as well for live streaming the event. And yeah, with that, I think I'll introduce our co-moderators for tonight. So Allison Donahue is the program manager of the Rapidian and has covered state and local elections in Michigan for the past 6 years. Whit Kilburn is a professor in the political science department at Grand Valley State University and specializes in American politics. So please give it up and welcome Allison and Whit.
Good evening and welcome to the 2024 Grand Rapids Mayoral Debate between Sunita Lanier and David LeGrand. Come on stage. Thank you to both of our candidates for being here and to all of you for joining us. Tonight we will focus on key issues that matter most to our community with questions based on a community survey sent out earlier this year. The topics include housing, the environment, transportation, development, equity, food access, public safety, and education. This debate is also being live streamed on GRTV, so we appreciate everyone tuning in to join us remotely. A rebroadcast of this event will air on GRTV's Live Wire every day before the election at 6 p.m.
Our debate format will be as follows. To begin, both candidates will have 2 minutes to give their opening statements. Then on, the moderators will ask a question. For each direct question, candidates will have 2 minutes to respond. The other candidate will have 3 minutes in rebuttal, then a 1 minute final rebuttal. 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and then 1 minute. If a follow-up question is asked, directed toward either candidate by name, the response is 2 minutes and no rebuttal. Later in the debate, we'll open the floor to audience questions. Please keep your questions focused, concise, and directed to both candidates. We ask that you refrain from using profanity, personal attacks, or endorsements. The candidates will be allotted 3 minutes for closing statements. Prior to the start of the debate, the candidates flip the coin to determine who will go first. Ms. Lanier will give the first opening statement and directly answer the first question. Ms. Lanier.
Thank you. Thank you, Allison, and thank you, Whit, for moderating, and thank you, Chris, for welcoming us here at the Wealthy Theater. I am Sunita Lanier, and I moved here at 9 years old, and I graduated from Preston High. Go Polar Bears. I am a Cornerstone Eagle. I have over 15 years in corporate experience working at the largest healthcare insurance provider in the state of Michigan, where I, earlier in my career, bargained on the UAW side and also spent time in management, human resources, and community affairs. I have owned my own business for over 10 years. I have served on both the school board as well as the city commission, and I am the only mayoral candidate who has completed every single term you have elected me to, because honoring my commitments is a value that I hold near and dear to my heart. And I am hoping to take all of that experience with me to serve this city as mayor. I will focus on the issues that are important to all of us, the issues with getting calls returned, trash picked up, safe streets, economic boom in thriving cities and walkable cities. I'll be focusing on those issues, and I'll fix those issues together with all of you, because though I have a lot of experience, I am wise enough to know that the only way to solve some of the issues that we have here in our city is by engaging with the citizens who live within, which is why I spent time doing the neighborhood connections. Since spring, I've hosted 11 of them to hear from residents about what it is that they desire in the future of our city. And then finally, I'll finish those issues together, because it's important, again, for me to honor my commitments. Thank you all so much for being here tonight, and I'm looking forward to this discussion with my opponent.
Mr. LeGrand. So I'm also grateful that you're here. It saves me the trouble of knocking your door if I haven't already knocked it. Maybe it'll speed up the conversation if I see you afterwards at your door. I've been having conversations in the community by knocking thousands of doors. And my campaign has knocked about 75,000 doors in the city, which means we've done our best to talk to about everybody at their homes. And that's a really important commitment for me and for our team, because we need to strengthen our community. This is a rough patch in American history, and we need to remind ourselves that what unites us is really important, and more important than what divides us. It's really important that we cut through some of the hyper-partisan rancor that we see all around us, and that we focus on things we can do together in ways we can make this city the best city in the country. Now, I have spent a lot of time talking to people at doors, and I think that for better or for worse, you can look at my website where we sort of divided into 3 big baskets, and those big baskets are justice and policing reforms, work on housing, and work on neighborhoods and infrastructure. And I know anytime you make a basket, there are things that kind of squish out of it and things that intersect and all of that. But those are areas where I'm really excited to get to work, and those are areas where I have some deep expertise. I was a prosecutor for 7 years for the Kent County Prosecutor's Office. I spent a lot of time out in private practice in town working in the criminal justice space, and I spent most of my life trying to fix the problem of mass incarceration in the United States. I'm excited to work on justice and policing reforms in Grand Rapids to deliver justice more fairly, more equitably, and more effectively. We can make our communities safer, but also make our justice system better. I'm also excited to work on housing. It is a real issue. Affordable housing is at a crisis level in our country and in our city. So I have lots of ideas on that. And I walked here. I'm excited to work on walking and cycling opportunities.
Thank you, Mr. LeGrand.
Our first question for Ms. Lanier. How should the city balance support for the economic development of downtown with the equitable development of neighborhoods? In your view, has the city struck the right balance between downtown versus neighborhood-focused development? And if not, how should it change?
I do not believe we've struck the right balance. While serving as the 3rd Ward Commissioner, it became apparent that through the data that the city offers, that we have underinvested in the 3rd Ward. As a result of learning this, we instituted the 3rd Ward Equity Fund. It was a fund that was started by myself and my former colleague, Dave Allen, where we did actually a protest during one of our strategic planning sessions when there were multiple projects on the walls and none of them were in the 3rd Ward. And that exercise started a robust conversation with the commission regarding the inequities that exist and the underfunding that had occurred in the 3rd Ward. And so because we have not done that well, the fund was established, and currently it's being funded at about $1 million a year. $1 million goes a long way in my bank account, but it does not necessarily go a long way when you're talking about reversing inequities in an entire region within the city. And so one of the ways in which we can reverse underfunding is by funding the Third Ward Equity Fund fully to be able to do some of the programs that exist within. And so some of them ties to businesses and economic development. We were investing in businesses. We were keeping people in their homes. We did lead awareness campaigns. Those are some of the things that we've done in the past with the funding. We've also invested in MLK Park and the lodge that is being rebuilt, that we had an investment from the Third Ward Equity Fund in there. And so those are some ways in which we can reverse that. But I think the other thing that I'd like to see is for us to expand the conversation regarding equity into other neighborhoods within the city, because there are other areas where we're underfunding.
Thank you. Mr. LeGrand.
So the origins of the Third Ward Equity Fund are perfectly understandable, but it's also true that we have 11 census tracts in Grand Rapids where there is acute poverty. And as a matter of fact, more of those are in the first ward than in the third ward. So it's important we have a conversation about how we lift everyone up in this community and we not zero in on one particular ward. Now, that being said, the way you framed the question at the beginning was an imbalance between downtown and the rest of the city. And that's exactly the right way to frame it. Because the wards were developed to have an equal number of people in each ward. They weren't developed for investment purposes. And the way they were drawn, the first ward has a good chunk of downtown, the second ward has a good chunk of downtown, and take a look, lots of big buildings going downtown. The real exacerbating problem that I think we have to address is, in the 70s, Grand Rapids started something called the Downtown Development Authority. And what it essentially does is it captures tax increases. Now, when you capture tax increases and only spend them in one specific area, so the downtown area captures those taxes and spends them downtown. The problem with doing that is you wind up with a rich get richer and a poor get poorer dynamic. The city of Detroit is actually just starting to have conversations about whether it is time to cap that effect in downtown Detroit. And I think that's absolutely a conversation we should have in Grand Rapids. We've had decades and decades of letting downtown spend its own tax dollars, and that gives us all kinds of distortions. And at the end of the day, we are not in the building business. We are not in the corporation business. We are in the human thriving business. And so the citizens of Grand Rapids deserve investment where the citizens think it should happen, not where a mechanism set up in the 70s makes it happen.
Thank you. Ms. O'Neill?
Yeah, I would just add that I think the structure that Representative LeGrand just spoke of is exactly the mentality of crabs in a bucket. Is when you know that you've done an inequity, and instead of addressing the inequity that you're trying to address with the Third Ward Equity Fund, you divert the attention to other things. So you can still have a Third Ward Equity Fund to right the wrong of the inequity, and you can also have thriving funds that can go towards other neighboring neighborhood districts to address those inequities as well. You don't have to take from one to address the issues of others. And so I think that's vitally important. The Third Ward Equity Fund should be fully funded to do what's right in the Third Ward, because the people of the Third Ward frequently, and if you've knocked on enough doors, hopefully you've heard that the people in the Third Ward will tell you that they know they've been underfunded.
Thank you. This next one will be for Mr. LeGrand first. What steps would you take to prevent displacement and gentrification as the city continues to grow?
Well, one of the things that I think we have to have an honest conversation about is the actions landlords take in a rising market. And so I think it's important we actually have conversations about caps on rental increases, because as people invest in the urban core and those areas get very popular, we are really destabilizing a lot of our population. The other thing that we really need to do, frankly, is we need to build a whole lot more housing. So I would encourage you all, there's a woman named Jerusalem Dempsis who writes for the Atlantic, who's gotten a very good summary of the fact that somehow people are always happy to talk about having more housing, they just don't want it next to them. They don't want it on their block. I walked here, as I mentioned before, and I counted 18 buildable lots between my house and here. That's just a walk down Wealthy Street. Some of those are a block deep. So, for example, there's a block between Sigsbee and Wealthy on Diamond. There's an entire block there that's just empty. So there's a lot we have to do to actually make sure that there's more housing, because the number one thing, historically, we've been very good about trying to talk about subsidizing people who need help. We've not been good enough about building more places. And it's one of the reasons Grand Rapids isn't growing as well as it needs to. So a lot more construction and a lot more help for those small developers who are, I hope, going to do 2 units and 4 units and 6 unit dwellings all over the city. So I'm excited to work on that.
Thank you. So as it relates to displacement and gentrification, a couple things that we instituted at the City Commission is we established community benefit agreements so that neighborhoods can have agreements with developers who are doing projects within their neighborhood. Because what we find frequently is a project will come in, especially if it's a large-scale project, and the results of that project will be either A, concentrating poverty, either B, displacement of people who have lived there and they can no longer live there, or C, you are bringing in a structure that people do not feel like they can have access to because of some of the requirements to be able to rent in this market. And so those community benefit agreements have contributed to allowing people to have a voice in the development that's happening in their neighborhoods. And I believe that's one way in which we can address some of the gentrification. I think the other thing is educating homeowners and families. And so frequently what will happen is there's an asset in the family that people believe it's, inhabitable. And they may acquire grandma's home after she passes away, and instead of keeping that property in the family, they're selling it because vultures are out trying to get them to sell it for next to nothing, and then they're flipping them, after they've purchased them from the families for pennies. And so there are a couple nonprofits who are working on trying to educate families on how to keep their assets their own so that we can then keep families local. And so when we have different development projects that what I believe we need multiple types of housing that's built in neighborhoods so that we can have the missing middle. So there are a group of people who are working right now who can't afford a home in this city. You also have affordable housing. There are people who are being displaced because the resources are, the market is increasing so significantly. So you have to build, you have to teach people how to retain what they have and the value of it, because if you sell, you can't, by law, determine or dictate who gets to buy that home. And so this is all part of educating everyday citizens, their contribution in gentrification. The last thing I'll talk about is the rental caps that LeGrand has just mentioned. And I'm curious to know if when you have, because you have rental properties, if you are capping your rental rates in all of the rental properties that you have. I know when my family owned a rental property, we did not charge our tenants market rate, and regularly we would ask them if they wanted to buy the property. We only had the one, but we knew that them having an asset actually helps them it will help to contribute to the economics of their family.
Mr. LeGrand.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad Ms. Zanir asked me, because it's true, and you can all look, one of the things that I think is really important is that we have financial disclosure from our elected officials, and so I put all my finances up online decades ago, and took me about 5 years to get financial disclosure at the state level, but that's something I absolutely want to require from all elected officials in the city. I also want a requirement that no elected officials in the city have control, direct or indirect, over 501c3s, because I think nonprofits are a really sticky thing for elected officials to get involved in. They can often self-enrich. So I do, as far as my properties go, yeah. For my residential, I only have 2 rental properties, but for both of them, I have a really simple mechanism. I give all of my tenants rights to renew and a guarantee that I'm not going to raise their rent more than 3% a year, because that gives them we don't want to act as though only homeowners get to be responsible citizens who invest in our community. Renters get to do that too, and they should be able to do that. But if you've only got a one-year lease, you don't know how long you're going to stay in the community.
Thank you, Mr. LeGrand.
Next question for Ms. Lanier on the subject of transportation. How should the city improve multimodal transportation to support equity throughout the city's neighborhoods?
Thank you for that question. I think this is a really good conversation to have. Frequently, when I'm talking to neighbors at their doors or in my neighborhood connections, people are talking about the cost of parking downtown. Recently, the commission made a decision to increase the parking rates after having not had those rates increased for a few years. And so there are people at the last forum we had last week, there was someone talking about the wage that he earns and the rates of parking to work downtown and the struggle with that. And I do believe that one of the solutions really is diversifying our modes of transportation. And I think that we have, with some of the scooters, with some of the transit shelters that I advocated for to make sure that the shelters were in place across the city so that people will have, if they were waiting on public transportation, they would have a place to be able to wait without the heat and without the extreme temperatures. And so I think we have to set up a system with a more robust transit system in order to get people out of their vehicles. And let's just be honest. We are in the state of Michigan where everything was built around the big three automakers. And so we have a structure in place that does not, it isn't convenient for us to get out of our vehicles, but one of the best ways for us to do so is if we have a transit system that can address some of those issues. I think that we should look at shuttles that shuttle people from within neighborhood business districts downtown and people who are downtown into the neighborhood business districts. And so I think that's another way for us to diversify how people are getting around in our city. I think we also have to have a conversation with the Rapid to be able to talk through how do we create a system that will work for all. Because not everyone is a biker, not everyone can afford an e-bike, not everyone can afford to pay for parking. And so we have to think about the residents who live in our city and how to build our infrastructure around that.
Thank you, Ms. Lanier.
Mr. LeGrand.
I suppose you can always say, not everyone can afford X. Bikes are not that expensive. And cars are really hideously expensive. Cars cost about $10,000 per car per year. So if we can build a world in which people, say, can be a one-car family instead of a two-car family, you put a lot of money in that family's pocket. So for me, this whole conversation really comes down to wealth building in the community among the people who have the least amount of money. So I'm excited by the idea of actually moving us a lot further forward on making Grand Rapids cycling friendly and pedestrian friendly. It's one of the reasons I'm proud I get the endorsement of Friends of Slow Streets, which is a cycling advocacy group. I have so many ideas. We can talk about this for the rest of the night, but I'm just going to give you a couple. And one of the things I want you all to know and walk away from this evening knowing is if a car hits somebody at 35 miles an hour, there's about a 90% fatality rate. If a car hits somebody at 25 miles an hour, there's about a 10% fatality rate. We may be at the point in this city this year where we lose more people to vehicular deaths than we do to murders. Now, that's a shocking moment. The fact of the matter is cars are becoming more dangerous, accidents are becoming more frequent, and we absolutely have to build a world in which it's safe to cycle, in which it's safe to walk. So I want to install 1,000 of those instant-on flasher intersections as soon as possible after the election. I want to install, I want to transition as many of our lights to four-way flashers instead of timed lights as possible as soon as I can after the election, because nobody races up to a four-way stop. I want to let neighborhoods petition to have two-way stops turned into four-way stops. Someone was killed down in the Third Ward just a couple weeks ago by a car because the other person blew through a stop sign. If that had been a four-way stop, that person would be alive. So it's really an important anti-poverty issue. It's a really important public safety issue. It's also important for a lot of other reasons. It's important because it's good for the environment. One of the things, we've cleaned our world up a lot since the 70s, but one of the big persistent pollution effects we still have in urban areas is tailpipe emissions. If we can get people to a world in which they can bike more often and walk more often, we simply have less pollution. It's also true that we need to, it's one of the reasons why we keep having to talk about building more housing. I was down at Pritchard and Clay the other day, got a tour of it. There are 1,200 people that work at that place. It's basically Madison and Cottage Grove. There's not nearly sufficient housing around there for people who have those jobs to be able to walk to work. But if we built more housing around where some of our job clusters are, we'd have a real opportunity to let people walk away from their cars. So it's something I'm excited to dig into.
Thank you, Ms. Lanier.
No,
Great. This next question is also on the topic of transportation. What changes would you advise, if any, to the city's parking meter policy, from placement of meters in neighborhood business districts to hours of enforcement and revenue collection? And I believe we're starting with Mr.
That's me.
LeGrand.
So I'm sorry, what was it? There was a cough. You said what changes?
If any, would you advise to the city's parking meter policies?
Sure. So there are ways in which you can actually free up more meters in the downtown core, and I think that's one of the primary frustrations people have. There are things that we can explore, but honestly, this is something that I really want to have a neighborhood and a community conversation about. This is one of the reasons why often in politics, and I've been doing this long enough that I've seen this again and again and again, politicians have an issue, they bring 4 or 5 people into a room, they make a decision, and then they come out and they sell it. Well, that's not democracy, that's marketing. Instead, I think we have to have a robust conversation on the front end when we're talking about policies like this, and then implement after we've had an actual open source discussion. So I intend, if I win the election, to institute something I'm calling Mayor's Monday, and I hope you all will start coming. And the first Monday we'll do it in the first ward, the second Monday we'll do it in the second ward, the third Monday we'll do it in the third ward, and we'll go back and we'll talk about big basket issues over and over and over again. Because I don't think we should ever stop talking about justice and policing issues. I don't think we're ever going to stop talking about housing and the need to do better on housing. I don't think we're going to ever be done investing in our neighborhoods, making our cities walkable, making our cities better. There are so many good ideas out in the community, and there's so many, I know a lot of you out here are great advocates on some of these issues, and you know more than I do about some of them. So politicians are necessarily limited in their expertise, and I think it's really important to bring the community into that conversation. Now, one idea I have, and I served on the parking board for a while. By charter, all of the money that comes from the parking revenue has to go into the parking system, and the only thing they can do with it is build more parking lots, which is a really strange mechanism. I would love it if the community had access to that money, and so that we as a people could talk about, okay, X amount of money came in from parking meters, what do we want to spend it on? Do we want to spend it on an arts program? Do we want to spend it on a new fire station? Do we want to spend it on an after-school program for children? So corralling all of the money into and keeping it in the feeding that parking monster.
Thank you, Mr. LeGrand.
Sorry.
Can you repeat the question? He talked about multiple things. I just want to make sure I have the right question.
Yes. The question is, what changes would you advise, if any, to the city's parking meter policy?
Okay, thank you. So I'll start off by just saying that this is one of the issues that people have varying responses on and varying views. I know as I served on the commission, we would have some people coming asking for more parking. We would have people coming asking for meters, even in their neighborhoods, on their blocks. We would have people saying no more meters and get rid of them, and others saying, you know, we don't mind paying, but we don't want to pay so much. And I think, from my perspective, because the views are varying, I don't think it can be a blanket one-size-fit-all process for addressing the parking needs across our entire city. It is an enterprise department of the city, so it does generate revenue, the mobility department, and so its goal as an enterprise is to generate revenue. And what they say is that it's intended to help move traffic along so that then you can have more activity in the business districts where the parking meters exist. So just to kind of give a little bit of context behind why our parking meter's there, and it's intended so that one person doesn't park there all day, and it prevents others from being able to shop in that same business district. So it's tied to an economic thread. What I would say is that each neighborhood should have a specific parking plan that works for them. And so what we're finding, I am the chairperson of the Southtown Corridor Improvement Authority, and it is a tax capturing authority that has multiple business districts, 6 business districts in the south side of the city. And in one of our business districts, we're having this very discussion now because of the decrease in parking that's being proposed because of a road construction project. And so we're having some conversations with the businesses that are there, as well as the residents that live there. And how do we address the parking needs with what's happening in that very neighborhood? And I think that it's going to be unique then to what's happening even downtown. I believe in general that enforcement should be, I've lived here long enough to remember when weekends were free and nights were free after 5 or 6 p.m. And I would like to see us go back to a model that's similar to that, because what I feel is that if we're trying to, the same way we're trying to attract people downtown, we also, into places where there are, you have parking meters where there's a lot of activity. So if you're trying to bring people into those business districts, you need to be able to make parking affordable so that, or contain it so that they can have access to the business districts that you're actually trying to attract them to. And again, I think it's because we haven't yet figured out how to diversify our mobility issues.
Thank you, Ms. Lanier.
Thank you.
Mr. LeGrand, you have a minute.
Sure. So I'm going to be totally geeky, guys. The grandfather of this conversation is a man named Donald Shoup, and he wrote a great book called The High Cost of Free Parking. And the simple analysis he makes is that the suburbs sort of happened and people built infinite oceans of parking lots, and it doesn't make things very livable. So a funny analog is happening at the zoo right now. So the John Ball Zoo, they sent out a survey and asked people, would you like to have more free parking at the zoo? And big surprise, the answer was yes. So now they're going to pave over a chunk of John Ball Park because everyone wants more free parking. One of the things that I think we have to start reminding ourselves is, you know how many parking spots a car takes? 1 or 2 or 3. You know how many a bike takes? 0. You know how many my shoes take? 0. So if we can actually build a world where people aren't using cars as much, our parking pressures are going to get reduced. So we absolutely have to build for density.
Thank you, Mr. LeGrand.
For Ms. Lanier, a general question about equity. According to the most recent U.S. Census estimates, the median white, non-Hispanic identifying household in the city earns an annual income of about $71,000 annually, while the median black or African American household earns about $40,000 annually. As mayor, what steps could or would you take to reduce this gap in income?
Thank you for that. I frequently talk about Grand Rapids being an amazing place to live. I grew up here, I've stayed here, I've raised my family here because it is such a great place to live. But we also have a lot of inequities that we hide in a junk drawer and really haven't spent the time addressing them. And this is one of them. We were on the second worst place to live for black people economically in the city of Grand Rapids on the Forbes list. And it's for this very question that you're asking with, and it's tied to economics. So let's go back to the conversation we were having about housing and helping families to know to keep assets within their families, because assets is the way you build wealth. So all of this is tied together, and we have to educate families on how wealth is built, how to keep wealth. We also have to educate and dismantle some of the racism that exists that prevents people of color from being able to have the same opportunities. That too happens here in our city. When we talk about the Third Ward Equity Fund, once again, we were keeping people in their homes because we know that it's more expensive to try to find housing for people if they lose their homes than it is to be able to have resources to keep people in their homes and helping them to thrive. We also, within the Safe Alliances for Everyone task force, we talk about how do we provide jobs, not only because the task force is tied to 14 to 24-year-olds. And so there is a component of the recommendations that ties to jobs for teens and young adults. But then we also have conversations about the economics of their parents so that children don't have to work. And how do we make sure that organizations who are designed to do economics with businesses understand the value.
Thank you, Ms. Lanier.
Thank you.
Mr. LeGrand, 2 minutes.
Yeah, so this is a great question. And I think, frankly, the answer is, the reality is even more profound than those statistics would indicate. Last I checked, last time I had to speak on this issue, the average family net worth of white folks in America was 10 times the average net worth of African American families. And that's a nationwide stat. So the reality is there's a huge multi-generational effect that's real to wealth that permeates our society. And I think that, frankly, look, racism is America's original sin. And the division between the haves and the have-nots that keeps accelerating in this country is maybe our biggest associated problem. And it's not only about race, but it is also a big problem. So I think if we're going to talk about substantial, actual, substantive things that we can do at the city, I think the first answer is we have to be honest about the huge importance of education for moving up the economic ladder. And that means that we have to absolutely walk alongside GRPS. We have to come up with innovative programs that are going to keep kids in schools. We've got to insist on great outcomes from our city schools. That's a huge part of how we actually help people succeed moving forward. We can't change the past, but we absolutely can change tomorrow. So the second thing is, and this is something I've spent most of my life working on, is our justice system is vastly disproportional in who it affects. It's massively disproportional. And it's so disproportional that affluent middle-class white people don't often understand the weight of the justice system in our community. When I worked on expungement, getting people's old criminal records cleaned up, when I started that work, there were about 100,000 people in this state eligible for expungement, and only about 4,000 or 5,000 of them a year were actually getting old criminal cases expunged. Someone without a criminal conviction, if you compare equal, imaginary people, one of them has a conviction on their record, one of them doesn't. If someone cleans up their criminal convictions, or the state does it for them, their income goes up 24% overnight, and it stays up for the rest of their lives. So I worked on bills in Lansing that have helped 1 million people in Michigan so far. Now, the fact that there are 1 million people that need that help is shocking. It's unconscionable. We also have to fix cash bond. We also have to fix sentencing guidelines. There are lots of, our justice system breaks families apart like that's the job it was designed to do. But at the city level, a big thing we can do is focus on not taking our young people and moving them into that justice track. So when I was on the school board, I instituted restorative practices in our schools. It cut suspensions and expulsions in half in our school. Because if you kick a kid out for 10 days, they'll come back with a better understanding.
Thank you, Mr. LeGrand.
Ms. Lanier, 1 minute.
Thank you. And to try to finish the thought that I had earlier was to create livable wage jobs for not only the children, but also for the families. What I've done as a commissioner is I have championed bringing businesses into, at that time, the Third Ward, and even looked in other areas outside of the Third Ward for a couple of the businesses that were looking to relocate here, because again, livable wages is the way to generating the income. Also partnering with small business incubators so that you can have Black families generating their own income through their own businesses. I am a part of the 5%. My husband and I own a commercial building. We learned at the MLK breakfast a couple years ago that only 5% of Black people in this country own commercial buildings. And so trying to reverse those type of statistics that exist nationally and locally is something that I value, because I think that's the only way we're going to get resolve these issues.
Thank you, Ms. Lanier.
Thank you.
This next question is on the topic of housing. Mr. LeGrand, you will start us off. How should you, or in your view, how should the city help the unhoused individuals living on our city streets?
I talk about this a lot on doors, and the first thing I say is we have to lead with empathy. It is really important that we actually understand that these folks are in an incredibly hard place. A long time ago, my friends and I started Four Friends Coffee House downtown, and that meant that we interacted a lot with the unhoused population. And all of the best studies that I see say that, frankly, at this point, I suspect we're sort of spending a penny when we need to be spending $1 on this problem. We're underspending. And that's partly because we're not willing to articulate the reality, which is about 80% of the money we spend to help the unhoused has to be spent on programming. It has to be spent on support services, because a lot of these folks have struggles that aren't as simple as they need an apartment. They need an apartment plus. So about 20 cents of your dollar ought to be spent on the actual housing, and about 80 cents ought to be spent on wraparound support services. So this is something that I think is a conversation we as a city ought to have, but one of the things we need to articulate it right at the beginning, I think, is this really simple principle. Everyone has a human right to not be assaulted in the middle of the night. Everyone has the right to not freeze to death when it's winter. We need to become and tents do not solve either of those problems. We need to become a zero-tent city. We need to put the resources into making that happen, and we need to make it happen immediately. We have to have non-tent options, and that's not housing. So don't let anybody be confused that I'm suggesting that the short-term solutions we do for those folks are the equivalent to housing. But we need to do something immediately to stop people having to live in tents. We need to then work into supportive solutions for those folks. But it's also true that that's the tip of an iceberg. For every one person who's sleeping in a tent, there's 9 people couch surfing. For every one person couch surfing, there's a whole bunch more people who are right on the stable.
Ms. Lanier?
Thank you. Thank you for this question. And this is another complex topic. People who are experiencing homelessness are not a monolith, and so the solutions to addressing homelessness in our city actually has to be just as diverse as the people who are experiencing it. And so, but what I will say that's very common is distrust for systems. And so what we were finding and when I served on the city commission is that a number of people would not engage with the nonprofits who had the mission of serving the unhoused. And part of why they didn't engage was because of the rules and regulations that the nonprofits would put on how you can frequent their establishments. So for an example, you couldn't bring in any of your personal items. Well, I'm sure many of you have seen that people who are unhoused are carrying a lot of their personal items with them wherever they go. So one of the simple things that we did in order to try to address getting shelter immediately for people is to give people a safe place to put their belongings so that then they would then go inside and get the shelter that they needed when the temperatures were frigid or when they were extremely hot. The other thing is nonprofit accountability. In Grand Rapids, we are program rich and impact poor. We are not short on organizations who are having the mission in our city to address a plethora of issues and needs. But somehow, some way, we still have some of the same issues plaguing our city year after year and decade after decade. And so there's something broken in the systems that we have in place to address some of these issues. The other is we instituted the homeless outreach team. And the purpose of this team was to be able to engage and meet the needs of those who are experiencing homelessness. And how we were able to do that, and it actually has been modified. It started off with fire and policing, and it has been changed to now fire and social workers, trying to address the needs, because what we know for sure is that when people realize that there are resources that exist for them and they can trust the system a little bit more to get those resources, it does help them to find shelter, that long-term shelter that they need. And so that's one way of addressing it. The other is making sure that we help to meet people where they are, because not everyone, and you know, I know a few stories of people who just simply do not want to come off the street. They are happy with how they're living. And so their families have tried, some of the systems have tried, and so you have to continue to try to work with them until they're ready to take whatever assistance that's needed.
Thank you, Ms. Lanier.
So the next question is on public safety for Ms. Lanier. How should the city more effectively reduce violent crime while building trust and confidence in policing throughout the city?
Thank you for that question. So public safety, this very issue is exactly what caused me to run for Third Ward Commissioner. At the time, I was serving on the school board as president, and I received a phone call from the superintendent at the time, who was calling early morning to share with me that there had been a shooting near one of our schools, and it was an elementary school. And I remember hanging up the phone and thinking, there's some 7-year-old brushing his teeth and he hears gunshot and he's frozen and he's not sure what to do next. Or there's a 7-year-old who's brushing his teeth and say, oh, they're just shooting again, grabs the backpack and leaves out the door. And in either scenario, it wasn't good. And so that's what caused me to run for commission. And one of the very first things that I started working on, and to this day I'm still a part of, is the Safe Alliances for Everyone task force. And we instituted a strategy to address violence and to reduce violence in our city. We have a plethora of programs that have been funded, including a mental health program for Black males between the ages of 15 through 24-year-old that was run through Family Outreach Center, some of the youth programming, that workforce programming, as well as recreation. We've had policy changes that have come through SAFE, and we funded over $600,000 in grassroots organizations to address violent acts in our city. In fact, there's a SAFE task force pitch night that's coming up at the end of this month. And so those are some of the ways in which I believe we can reduce violence. As a part of that is police and community relations. And so people who are a part of the task force is made up of the police department, as well as the prosecutor's office, and then grassroots nonprofit and nonprofit organizations, as well as commissioners, all sitting at the table to find solutions to address violent acts.
Thank you, Ms. Lanier. Mr. LeGrand?
Yeah, so this is, again, where I've spent most of my life working and thinking. And so this is a very complex issue, and I just want to highlight a few things for you. First of all, in the last couple of years, actually it only opened about 3 months ago, Grand Rapids had a 12-bed mental health stabilization center, which is great because it means that if someone's in an acute mental health crisis, the first option is not to simply take them to the jail. So there are lots of ways in which we can better triage and better respond to incidents that don't always involve an armed violent response, and that's something we really need to work on. As a matter of fact, I did a ride-along with the police department last week, and our first call was out to a hospital where someone had been stabbed in the neck and they were in the hospital. Well, you don't need an armed response if you're going out to the hospital to take a witness statement, right? The next response was to a car crash down by Calvin College. Again, don't need an armed response. If the EMTs are there and you're trying to get witness statements, you don't need an armed response. The third call was a kid was missing down in the Alger Park neighborhood. Again, don't need an armed response if a 10-year-old has wandered away from home. So I think it's really important that we have one of the ways we're going to rebuild legitimacy in our policing force is if we don't see everything that happens in our community as something that needs an armed response. There's an old joke about this, which is if you only have a hammer, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's time that we actually focus on defining our policing as peacekeeping and problem solving and not as coercion and domination. And that's a cultural transformation that's going to take some time, but it's a really important community conversation to have so that people feel like they're actually served by the police system and not have it be something that's imposed on them. As far as reducing violent crime, I'll just give you another thing. I actually recruited the Aspen Institute, which is a national think tank that does work on this issue. They were looking for cities around the Midwest to come and do a long-term investment in, you might call it intersectional work. So they look at what they call the justice ecosystem. So it's housing and education and our medical system and how all of those things interplay with our justice system so that we can solve some of the repeated chronic problems that pop up over and over again because of some issues that aren't maybe directly involved in the justice system. That group is committed to spending about $750,000 a year for the next 5 years to actually come up with good responses to that. I was the chair of that for a while. I had to hand that off because I got too busy doing other things, but that group is, it's the police department, but it's also advocacy groups in the community. It's also health providers. It's also the school system. So holistic look at how we can do things better is absolutely key.
Thank you, Mr. LeGrand.
Yeah, I'll finish with the anti-violence strategy that SAFE is. A couple other things we worked on too when I served as commissioner. The 12-point plan, we worked on that with the local NAACP and other nonprofit organizations, and we instituted the body cams through the 12-point plan. So we're asking neighbors how do they want to be policed and working through policies that address how policing should happen in our city. Another initiative we piloted and then expanded was adding social workers to our patrol vehicles. And so we piloted that. It worked really well. We've added, the city has added more since I left, and I'd like to see us continue to look at that data to see how we can continue to expand that program. And then I think we should continue to look at the data to see how we're policing within the city. And so data tied to like the traffic stop studies that we did some years ago, revisiting that data to make sure that there aren't any inequities and how we're policing.
Thank you, Ms. Lanier.
Thank you.
Our next question is on the subject of education for Ms. Lanier. During the 2023 to 2024 school year, 41% of GRPS...
I think I may have gone first the last time. I want to make sure.
Yeah, this is actually, we have 1 minute for Mr. LeGrand to respond to the question on public safety.
Okay.
That's right.
I was
Yeah.
just trying to make sure he started first on that one, but that's a good point. No, I think I was responding on that. I went first, then he went.
Now we're all confused.
Sorry.
All right.
So he should go first on the next
I
question.
think she did just respond, but
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah, I
Okay,
did
perfect.
respond.
You're right.
Yeah.
All right, Mr. LeGrand, this question is for you then.
Right on.
Just want to be equitable.
All right.
Big stakes here.
Okay, here it is. During the 2023 to 2024 school year, 41% of GRPS students were chronically absent. State data analysis reveals that economically disadvantaged students are disproportionately affected by chronic absenteeism. How would you address this issue as mayor with GRPS schools?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big issue, and Ms. Lanier and I were both on the school board together, and this is something that is not a new issue that we have to deal with in GR schools. It's really important that kids be able to go to school, and one of the stats that I remember, and I can't tell you what the current stat is, but when I looked at it not too long ago, 30% of the kids who went to Union High School had more than one address in the course of the school year. It's really hard to study for your calculus test if your home's out on the curb. It's really hard to get ready to go to school in the morning if you've been evicted. So one of the things that we absolutely have to work on in the city, and I'm excited to do some work on this, there's a lot of innovative work that's been done on reducing evictions, and that's really important work because evictions really, really fall on children a lot, and it falls on their education, and it's a real problem. Now, it's also true that during COVID, a lot of kids sort of got the memo that it was okay to not go to school. So this is something that we're really going to have to partner with our schools on to make sure that those kids are back. And your stats, a little old, but the current stats aren't great either on absenteeism. So that and reading at grade level and performing math at grade level the numbers are really bad right now. And unless we're honest about the problem, we're not going to have a hope of finding solutions for it. One of the things that I'm actually hoping to institute is combining the best characteristics of Uber with the best characteristics of tutoring. I would love to see an open source model for helping kids in our school get tutored. I think that we can do it roughly the way that Uber does it, and we can pay. A lot of our tutoring has traditionally relied on volunteers, and the problem with that is I don't remember anything about calculus. I might be in a position to volunteer, but I don't remember my high school math at all. The best people to tutor are the 21 to 25-year-olds who probably have to work right now, and so they couldn't be here, but they also don't necessarily have the time to tutor for free. So I'd
Thank
love
you,
to have
Mr.
the city get
LeGrand.
involved in that.
As it relates to absenteeism, I think the first thing that we have to do is acknowledge that all families are not situated similarly. And so there are families whose older children are taking care of younger children so that parents can string together 2 and 3 jobs to make ends meet. And as a result, they start making some decisions about the priorities within their families. And so you have children who are becoming breadwinners or caregivers in families because of what's happening right now with the economics that we just talked about in our city. And I think we have to start off with acknowledging that, because it's a factor that weighs into some of the chronic absenteeism. The other piece is the housing question that we were talking about. There are a number of people that are being displaced. So if landlords are going up 3% every single year on rents, eventually they will be pricing people out of homes. And then people can't afford to live there. And what we know for sure is that landlords are going up on their rents to make sure people leave their rental units in order for them to get more money for the housing that they have. And it's impacting families, including the children. The data says right now that we are experiencing more and more families who are experiencing homelessness in our very city than we have at any other time before. And it's all tied to how we are navigating through our city during this what I would call this increase in residents here in our city who can afford more than what people who have been here for decades and all their lives can afford. And so some of the solutions are just as complex as some of the other questions we've been talking about, because it's having honest conversations with people who are the landlords who are charging more and more for rent and displacing people. It's having conversations through our school and community liaison committee that we have between the city of Grand Rapids and the school in the school district to make sure that we're talking about how to work on things together jointly for our students. It's how do we take the empty buildings that the school district have currently and build housing within them. So these are the types of conversations we have to address something that we think on the surface, when you're privileged, you think is just about truancy and people are not coming and not sending their kids to school and COVID had something to do with it. No, families are struggling right now and they're making the best decisions that they possibly can make with the resources that they have during the time that they're struggling with. And so I think we need to have a little bit more sympathy for them and increase after-school programming too.
Mr. LeGrand, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, so I think if the question is how do we help kids get into the schools, I think that and stay in schools. There are lots of ways to do that, and that's one of the reasons why it was so important for me that we use restorative practices as a method of dealing with kids who are experiencing some problem in school, rather than the sort of expel and shun model, which is what a 10-day suspension is or an expulsion is. If you kick a kid out of school, they're not likely to come back with a better understanding of calculus or U.S. history. They're not likely to have all their problems solved by being out in the community for 10 days. And largely, we're talking about families that don't have someone home during the day. And so that leaves those kids unsupervised. So it is a really acute issue of justice that we have to address. And if we can keep those kids in school, that's great. But it's also true that restorative practices, which essentially means having conversations and unpacking the issues rather than just kicking a kid out or declaring them truant, is such an important part of how we deal with
Thank you,
any of these
Mr.
issues.
LeGrand. We have 1 more minute before we open the mic up for, or 1 more question, before we open the mic up for public questions. So if you are interested in asking a question directly to one of the candidates, again, not one of them, we ask that you ask both candidates. Please do not direct your questions to one candidate. But if you would like, you can line up here after this next question when we open it up to public comment, public question. I hope all that made sense. It will. It'll make sense. We'll all get there together. All right. This last question is on environment and sustainability. I believe it is you, Ms. Lanier, who will start us off. How do you plan to mitigate disproportionate environmental contamination faced by communities in previously redlined parts of the city?
Thank you so much for that question. So the City of Grand Rapids, back when I was on the commission, started the C4 group that was designed to try to address our goal at the time. It was carbon neutrality by 2025. Well, we're around the corner from that. And at some point, it was extended to 2030. And the purpose of starting this coalition was to bring different people from different sectors to one table to try to have these conversations. And so that work is underway, and they have, it was kind of slow starting, and but now it's underway, and they have a number of recommendations that they're making. And what I think is important is for us to make sure that everyday citizens understand their role in reaching this goal. I think the same could be said about businesses that are in the city too, because the city has made some changes in our fleet. We've made changes with LED lights across the city. We've made changes in our buildings, but we can't get to carbon neutrality without everyone in the city contributing to this. As it relates to red line communities, I think this is all part of the same. One of the initiatives that, as I was serving on the commission that I was a part of, was the lead task force that we had at the county, as well as a lead task force for the city. And we were addressing some of the inequities that existed in the houses that were red line, and making sure that people knew how children can be poisoned by lead in those homes. And so that's one way, one example of how we're addressing that. But I think the key piece is making sure people know how they're recycling, how the vehicles that they drive, the bikes that they ride
Thank
contribute.
you, Ms. Lanier.
Thank you.
Mr. LeGrand?
Yeah, on this issue, I think we have to do more than publicity and talk. I actually, at this point, solar power is essentially a mature technology. I think that it is possible to displace all of the electric use in the city of Grand Rapids with solar power in Kent County. If we do that, and the city's got kind of two superpowers here. One is we can bond, which means we can get cheaper money than you all can. The second is that cities can be utilities. So I think it is time for us to reclaim our power to be a utility and actually get into the business of energy production. Now, what is that going to do for people in the traditionally redlined areas? Well, one thing it's going to do is it's going to reduce pollution. Another thing it's going to do is it's going to mean that we can open the doors to have a conversation. I was actually just drafting an editorial today about a new proposal at the state level that we buffer people's water bills. And so we don't ever cut anybody off from water, because water is kind of important, and that we, because there are about 800,000 people in the state of Michigan who are behind in their water bills currently. It's a big deal. It's a big problem. So energy is also utility. We don't even have a graduated income tax in the state of Michigan. We don't have a graduated income tax in the city of Grand Rapids. The feds have a graduated income tax, and it's got lots of problems, but at least they tried. I think that at the city level, we need to work towards some graduated principles in our taxation. But I also think if we actually get into the energy production business, who says that rich people have to pay the same amount as poor people for their electricity? Consumers is a monopoly, and so they get to charge everybody the same amount, and that's their basic model. We can change that business model if we actually change our model for where the power comes from. So that's an exciting possibility.
I think, I'm sorry.
Nope, if you are done, Ms. Lanier.
Yeah, okay. I think also in redlined, historically redlined neighborhoods, education is really critical, because what we find is that absent of information, people just aren't aware of their role in this. And so not just even in redline neighborhoods, we're finding that across the entire city. So making sure people understand how they can contribute to this reduction is important. I think the city should also use its bond rating to leverage its bond rating for dollars that they can then allow citizens and residents to be able to tap into those resources without high interest rates of return to make some of the changes that they would like to see in their own homes. And then I think it's important to engage with other neighboring municipalities to make sure that we're working together to create the structures surrounding our needs across our entire region. Thank you.
Thank you. We are now at the public question portion of the debate. I did promise we would get here. So if you are interested in asking a question to both of the candidates, you can line up right here at the microphone. And if you have any issue with coming up to the microphone, we have a volunteer who will be able to pass around a microphone if you just raise your hand. Again, please remember, keep it polite. No swearing, no mean names. Ask the question to both candidates, please, and no campaigning, please. No endorsements either.
No endorsements?
No endorsements, please.
Okay. I'm not going to tell you my name. I'm in the witness protection program. But
One more second about the rules. We will have 2 minutes for each candidate to respond to the public's questions. No rebuttals in this round of questions. Thank
all right,
you so
here's my
much.
question to both of you. How does your faith inform your worldview and how you govern, if it informs it at all?
I believe this is Mr. LeGrand this time, but I'm guessing at this point.
I'm going to give you a complicated theological answer, and you may or may not like it. There is a story in the New Testament. St. Peter is outside of the circle while Jesus is on trial. And he's essentially intimidated and threatened, and he denies that he has anything to do with Jesus Christ. That was obviously a failing, and it was a very bitter failing for him. I think that there is a reverse and equally plausible ethical problem, and that is to claim faith and use it for political advantage. And I absolutely and always try to decline to do that. Now, I'm happy to talk with you about my values that inform my political work, but I do not want you voting for me because I'm a member or a follower in a particular faith tradition. So I hope that's a subtle enough answer for you, but I simply do not want to campaign and get faith involved in it. I will tell you that I think that, as I've said before, America's got some big challenges, and I'm happy to tell you that I'm what I call a radical egalitarian. What do I mean by that? I mean, about 150 years ago, we decided that democracy was not a race test. About 100 years ago, we decided it was not a gender test. But it's also not an IQ test. And it's also not a work ethic test. And I profoundly believe that absolutely everyone in our community has an equal right to an equal voice in how our community does what it does and works on it what it works on. And so I am happy to instantiate what I believe in, which is the proper dream of democracy, which is that radical egalitarian view. But I'm going to politely decline to answer the faith question.
Thank you, Ms. Lanier.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I wear my faith and take my faith everywhere with me because it's who I am, and I can't separate those two. And what my faith does do for me as I'm serving civically is it helps me to see, and you probably have witnessed this in some of my responses tonight, is empathy for the least of these. And so it's important to be able to treat others the way you would want to be treated, or do unto others as you would have them to do unto you. When I'm talking about the woes of our city, when I'm talking about the injustices that exist with racism here in Grand Rapids, when I'm talking about the culture that creates likes and those and dislikes in people, and have nots in people, and structures, when you redline, that's a racism thing. And so my faith actually helps me to see some of the wrongs that have been in existence here in this city, and it helps me to know that those wrongs need to be changed. And so it actually charges me to be able to do what I think is right, and giving everyone a voice at that table to be able to create the change that they would want to see. I respect others who have a different faith than mine, and those who don't have faith at all, because they have a right to be able to do that. My faith says that people have a choice in that. And so just because I have faith doesn't mean that everyone else needs to, and I know how to respect that. But it's vitally important to be able to serve this entire community. Divisiveness is not a part of my faith. So when I see people pit one another, people against others, and create divisiveness, my faith says that's not how you lead. and that's not a good leadership trait. And so it's important to be able to look at people
Thank you,
and
Ms.
provide.
Mayor.
Thank you.
Yes, my name is Reggie Howard, and I'd just like to know, we always keep hearing affordable housing and we need more housing, but what is your plan for the families that have been displaced? And now that the city has allowed these landlords to increase the rent, so now tenants have evictions on their record, which we all know with an eviction, you cannot get an apartment in some of these apartment complexes. So what is your plan to help displaced families be allowed to get affordable housing?
Ms. Lanier, you start.
Thank you for that question. I'll start off by sharing that the city is not in control over the rent rates in our city. So there is a state law that would have to be changed in order for there to be what we call rent caps put on rental units within our city. So that's part of what the challenge is. And I don't know, Representative LeGrand, if you recall this when I served as a commissioner and you were a representative, as this was budding in 2014, I called a meeting with you, and at that time, Senator Brinks was a representative, sharing that the state needed to be aware that there was this housing issue brewing and that there would probably be a cry for rent control at the state level, because what we're seeing is that landlords who can increase their rents will do so, because we live in capitalistic America. And so that's what people do. When we had a rental property, we didn't increase the rents for over 8 years for the tenant who was in there, because we were trying not to be a contributor to this very high market that we were experiencing. And so I think some of what we have to do is encourage developers to build housing, because the city doesn't build it itself. I think some of what I talked about was partnering with the schools to get some of those empty buildings in order to incentivize housing in some of those buildings, because the footprint of them is a lot of land for us to be able to build some housing in. So those are the types of things that we can do. We have the affordable housing fund to be, so when developers are building, the tax breaks that they're getting are going into this fund to be able to address some of the needs for families who have experienced eviction or who are trying to get into some of the rental units. It is an extremely complex problem, and I think we also need to look at different parts of our city to be able to address some of it too. Thank you.
Mr. LeGrand.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So a couple things. Going back to my earlier point, which is we need to build a lot more housing. And this is kind of how the law of supply and demand works. If people are, my son was applying for an apartment earlier today and 20 people were lined up to look at it. In that kind of environment, landlords have a lot of power, right? So, in a world in which 10% of the housing units in town are up for rent, not 0%, maybe landlords have to knock their prices down, right? So that's one answer. The second answer I want to give you, and thing to think about, is landlords can sometimes do, let's call them, for lack of a better word, garbage evictions. They serve eviction papers. They don't have any good basis for doing it, but the tenant's not legally sophisticated, right? And so they lose. One of the things that cities like Milwaukee have done is give people who are in the eviction process the right to an attorney right from the jump, and it cuts down on a lot of those unjust, fraudulent, garbage, whatever you want to call them, evictions. And that's something that I've actually already talked with legal aid in Grand Rapids about starting in Grand Rapids. The third answer is, Ms. Lanier said we don't control rents in Grand Rapids. We kind of do. And here's what I mean by that. We tax owner-occupied houses way lower than rental properties, which means we don't admit it, but we double tax renters in this community. Now, there is a new program called Payment in Lieu of Taxes. It's called Pilot. And what that program potentially can do is actually start to equalize the property tax rates between renters and homeowners. Because I'm glad for people who can own a home. I own my home, but people who can't afford to own a home still need somewhere to stay, and double taxing them on their property taxes makes no sense to me. There are 400 square foot apartments in this town where the tax bill on that unit per month is north of $300 a month. Well, it's kind of tough to rent a place for less than $300 a month.
Thank
the
you,
tax
Mr.
bill is
LeGrand.
$300 a month, right? So that's somewhere
Thank you,
we
Mr.
need to
LeGrand.
equalize.
So you'd go down on and not increase your rents, is what you're saying, if you weren't
Sorry,
taxed?
we're not doing rebuttals on this round, but thank you. Next question.
Hello, I'm Andrew Carley, Third Ward resident. So I get to talk about housing a lot in my normal work, and in part of that we talk about how zoning code affects pretty much everything in housing. And so our large question is, what would you do, or what would you change in our current zoning code, and why?
Sorry.
Oh, this one is Mr. LeGrand starting.
Oh man, this is so exciting. So I was at a breaking ground for a new house, a single family on the north side of town a while ago, and I asked him, why isn't this a duplex? And the answer is, we have to have a driveway. And I said, well, why do you have to have a driveway? And the answer is, in the 1880s, the fire department wanted to be able to get their horses to the back of the building. Well, that's not a great thing to have in your city code, right? So the first thing we need to do is we need to get rid of zoning things that prohibit people building more. The next thing we have to do, and there's another example. So we just passed something to let people do accessory dwelling units in town, but we don't let them hook up to their house's water and sewer, which makes it a whole lot more expensive to build an ADU, and the amount you can afford to rent something out for directly relates to the cost of how much it costs to build it. So we need to get rid of that dumb requirement. Another dumb thing we need to get rid of in our zoning code is the prohibition on composting. I have no idea why that's in there. Was there like a great plague outbreak in 1963 that I missed that was caused by composting? I really doubt it. Another one is this vague language that technically stops you having trees in your front yard. You're not allowed to have any vegetation. It says vegetation or weeds, which is taller than 6 inches. I actually got cited for this over at Long Road Distillers, which I'm an owner of, and I called the city up and I'm like, you just planted 2 trees. I don't think you want me to cut those down, and the rest of it's sidewalk. So getting rid of that, the thing that essentially stops you doing native plantings, which makes no sense to me at all. Also, like, I tried to talk about turning a 3-unit I own into a 4-unit because it would have been better layout, would have been more housing. And the response I got from the city was, well, your grass to house ratio would be wrong then. I'm not in the grass business. I'm in the business of trying to provide people housing. The other one that they came back to me on was, you don't have the right parking ratios. Like, how about you let the people who are going to be renting the house decide? Like, they're probably not going to walk up and say, shucks, I forgot to check if there was parking.
Thank you.
Good question. And I know that recently the commission adopted a slew of zoning changes. And to be honest with you, because I'm campaigning, I haven't studied those changes to know kind of what's still undone. But here are a few that could have potentially been in that recent zoning changes. And one of them is tied to the ADUs. I think one of the things that we did well was talk about ADUs and the possibility of the accessory dwelling units on properties. What we haven't done so well is help people, everyday citizens, again, to understand their role in this. And so being able to build on top of your garage or in your backyard and tapping into the utilities that exist in the main house is another way to increase housing. I think the other thing, when we did the smaller lots, I think it's now 19 feet wide. That's another way that we're trying to attract residents to building more housing in our city. And I think, again, we need another robust campaign, because part of the issue is that everyday citizens do not understand their role in this. And we design everything at the city for larger developers or even our nonprofit developers, and not for a citizen who may have a small lot next to them that they could easily purchase and maybe put a property on. And again, I think the city could leverage its bond rating to be able to get resources so that it can tap into those resources so that we can get more housing built, because we can't solve this problem waiting on developers that build large-scale units to address it, because that's what we're seeing now. We have been seeing a lot of large-scale projects, but we're not seeing the changes in the way people are experiencing homelessness in our city because of it. And so we have to, all hands on deck, everyone has a role in it.
Thank you, Ms. Leah.
Hi, I'm Zachary. Thanks for being with us. I had a question about intercity transit. So I've never owned a car, and since 2020, I found that we no longer have buses that service the city, like connect Grand Rapids to other cities in the evenings and the mornings. So I can't go to church in Kalamazoo anymore because I can't make a round trip in a day. I can't go to music concerts in Lansing because I can't make a round trip in a day anymore. And I'm wondering, how are you thinking about advocating for Grand Rapids within intercity transit, like connecting with the state level, or just making sure that our city is less of a transit desert, which I feel like it has become?
Yeah, I think that's me, right? Just want to make sure.
It is you this time.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And, we are having an even challenging time connecting transit to even the suburbs in this city. And so each of those cities can vote on whether they would have the public transportation to come out to their cities. And because some of our neighboring cities don't want those people to come out there, they're voting that down. And it's unfortunate because what they're also doing is preventing the opportunity for people who are working, trying to get to a neighboring city, or people who are trying to tap into the entertainment in their cities to get to their city. I'm not sure that I know much about, instead of the regional transit, it sounds like you're saying a little bit further outside of the region and tapping into transit that way. But I would say we have to fix what's happening in our region first. And one of the things that I'd like to do is work with neighboring municipalities to be able to find out what are some of the issues that they're experiencing. I know out in Tanger, which is in Byron Center, they had a vote maybe a year and a half ago where they didn't want transit coming out there. And so that's a good example of how do we make sure that we have those conversations so that, and maybe people wouldn't want to go where they're not wanted, because that's also a factor too, but I think we do need to have those conversations as it relates to economics.
Thank you, Mr. LeGrand.
Your question was about trains between cities, essentially, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I love trains so much.
I'm sorry, buses.
Pardon?
Buses specifically.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, let me start with I love trains. So one of the things I love about trains is you don't get car sick in them. And I actually had a great conversation recently with a guy who ran the land bank in Lansing area, and he's a huge advocate for actually setting up rail connections between Grand Rapids and other cities. And trains allow you to work on them. They're you don't have to go through the TSA line. They're a huge mobility asset for people that don't have a car or who don't want to leave their car behind, right? Especially if you're going into a new urban core where you don't necessarily know the place, and they're like, it's like really, really nice to be able to do mass transit. So I am most urgent that we connect to Kalamazoo, and the reason I'm most urgent that we connect to Kalamazoo is because if you look at a map, it goes Chicago, Kalamazoo, Detroit. If we're going to get fast, high-speed rail ultimately between Detroit and Chicago, it's going to go through Kalamazoo. So I think we need to make sure we've got a robust and upgraded train line that gets us down to Kalamazoo as often as possible. We'll have to have trains to Lansing too, but it's not perfect. I know that buses have the advantage of being more flexible, but I would really like to see us invest. They do it in Europe, it works. They do it in the East Coast, it works. We are in a good, dense city, and the more we make this a good, dense city, the more we're going to want opportunities to simply leap out of it and go to other cities, and I think trains are the way to go.
Thank you.
Good evening. John Willett, resident of the 2nd Ward. I see Commissioners Knight and Sassi here tonight. Thank you for being here. I didn't know there would be this opportunity, so I don't have notes with me, so I'm going to round some of the numbers. There's a proposal, it's going by different names, the 3 Towers or the Fulmar proposal. Those of us who have been around Grand Rapids for a while think of it as the old Charlie's Crab location. And that proposal is mixed-use development of about $750 million. And they are in the initial phases of the brownfield process under the new brownfield rules, and are asking for about $500 million in tax capture over the next 20 years. So 2/3 of the project would be paid for with tax capture. And then they're offering currently about $8.5 million for affordable housing over those same 20 years. So my math would put that at a little less than 2% of the tax capture going to affordable housing. Some folks, myself included, are kind of astounded by that really big ask, $500 million for a private development, and a little shocked to hear so little going into the needs of, regular folks. And I wondered what you folks would have to say about that this evening.
Mr. LeGrand?
Yeah, so I have been spending a lot of time and energy recently on what I think is potentially going to be a transformative tool for Grand Rapids, and that is an active and not a passive land bank. So while I was in office at the state, the Kent County got rid of its land bank, and there were arguments for why it wasn't perfect, but that's water under the bridge. So it turned out Detroit was the only city that was allowed to have a land bank. So I wrote a bill that let cities have land banks. Grand Rapids now can have a land bank. In fact, has just taken the first step to creating a land bank. Now, traditionally, land banks are things that properties just sort of fall into, and then you try to get them out into better use. If we think a little bigger, and we start to think of the land bank as an acquirer of parcels like the thing on Fulton Market, future projects like that, if they're coming out of a land bank, you get all the benefits of a community benefit agreement. You get to sort of have your cake and eat it too. So we, the community, can capture some of the real value of a development like that because it came through a land bank in the first place, and then we can use the money to do lots of good work in affordable housing. So I'm really excited about that possibility. Now, the details of that current specific project, you're right, it's a little astounding when you put the numbers like that, right? The good news, for what it's worth, is I think it's a really bad deal the state made, because almost all of those tax giveaways are the state not taking state income tax from all the people who live there, which is really weird, but at least we're not going to lose money in the city. And as a matter of fact, if those things are fully occupied, my back in the napkin math is we'll get about $5 million in additional income tax from the businesses that are there and the people that live in that residence, and that's money also that we can, so new money is always a lot easier to use than old money, right? It's a whole lot easier to come up with, to do transformative work if you're not pulling money away from something else.
It's your turn.
Thank you for your question. This is not uncommon for our city, where we have private developers and some who may be tied to nonprofits and do some of their development through the nonprofits that they own, creating extremely large projects, and also then asking for tax breaks from the state and the city in some way, shape, or form to try to make the numbers work for them. What I know for sure is that it is very expensive to build housing. This is not unique to our city. It's a nationwide issue, and so I do recognize that there are some challenges with the formulas that developers are having with building units, how much it costs to build them, and if they're going to make them rental units, how do we get them affordable instead of all market rate? What I think is critical to a project of this size is making sure that there is affordable ownership that's a part of it. I think that, and also making sure that there are more units that are affordable units that are rentals that's tied to it. And if I were on the city commission, like I did with a very large scale project that Amplify was doing, this would be one of the projects I dig my heels in on to make sure that people were aware that a community benefits agreement is the best way to structure a project this size and of this magnitude, because you cannot on the back end trust that you're going to get the benefits that you're looking for local citizens if you do not bake it into the existing project now. And it's unfortunate because this keeps happening time and time and time again, and people's voices are being diminished. We don't end up having enough
Thank you, Ms.
market.
Mayor.
Thank you.
Hi, Amy, 3rd Ward. Thank you both for being here tonight and for doing this event. both of you throughout the night have spoken about a number of programs you would like to implement or maybe expand that sound like really promising programs and clearly would not be free to implement. So I wanted to ask if you could both speak a little bit to how you would implement those things that you want to do to address issues while maintaining a balanced budget. What might you cut funding from? Where would you get additional revenue?
Ms. Lanier?
I can start. So all of the initiatives that I've spoken on are initiatives that I have started as a commissioner. And how I would want to expand some of them really is where do you place them within the budget? So let's start with Safe Alliances for Everyone. That task force, its budget right now has come from the general fund. What I would like to see is that program to get its money from the police department's budget because it's tied to police and community relations. It's tied to keeping our city safe. And so if public safety has a budget that is robust, then why not do public safety related initiatives through that budget? And so I would like to see SAFE funded out of the police department's budget. Another one is the Third Ward Equity Fund. And I'm not sure this year where in this current budget where they funded it. It's currently being funded annually at $1 million. And at some point it was through ARPA dollars that it was being funded while I was serving on the commission. So I'm not exactly sure where it is now. And so I would probably need to do a little bit of homework to find out where it is funded currently to see how we can increase the funding for the Third Ward Equity Fund. And I'll stop there before it cuts me off.
Mr. LeGrand?
Great question. So let me take my three baskets then: justice, housing, and neighborhood development. So in the justice area, I think we actually pick up money, and here's why. If we reduce the number of people incarcerated in our community, we actually are paying about $100 a day, last time I checked, to the county for every person who's incarcerated for every day they're incarcerated. So if we can reduce our incarceration levels in the city, we just pick up money. The second thing is in the justice space. Right now, and this is a longer conversation, guys, but basically suburban outlying courts make money because they run speed traps. City courts lose money. We are subsidizing our city courts right now to the tune of about $8 million a year. I've been working for years, and there is a plan to equalize funding, and that's something I'm going to have to get done at Lansing. The State Court Administrator's Office is way deep in this, but if we can pick up $8 million there if we just make court funding fair and we disincentivize speed traps and ADA. So moving on to housing, I think I alluded briefly, but we can actually pick up a significant money if we run a land bank the right way, if we accumulate properties and parcels, and then we put them up for bid and put them out in the community. We can make money there. The other thing that I think we need to work on, though, because of the scale of the problem, I said we got to stop spending pennies when we need to spend a dollar. The housing issue is a hundreds of millions of dollars problem. It is a big problem. So if we want to be the best city in the country on this issue, and I think we should, and I think we can, we need to identify new funding sources. I've talked with folks about this. There was some question about a millage. The problem with the millage is everybody pays it year after year after year, and you pay it whether you've lived in your home for 40 years or whether you lived in your home for 40 minutes. I think a much more attractive option here is to work on the transfer tax. And the transfer tax is what happens when you sell a house. In LA and San Francisco, they use this very well to pick up a lot of money that they are using for housing. Sorry, there's other stuff too.
I also want to say I'm excited to see this line here. We have time for 3 more public questions before we hand it back over to the candidates for their closing statements. But I do hope that both candidates will be able to stick around in the lobby and you might be able to catch them there to ask more questions or further the conversation. So thank you everyone who came to ask questions. I hope that there's time still to continue the conversation. Sorry.
Sure. Hi, my name is Marshall Kilgore. I'm the Director of Engagement for the West Michigan Environmental Action Council. There was a member of the Grand Rapids Climate Coalition that could not come tonight that is a part of the Urban Core Collective, and I'd just like to uplift their question. Their question is, emissions benchmarking is a process that helps companies and organizations understand their greenhouse gas emissions in relation to their peers in previous years. Many are proposing this approach in Grand Rapids to help us reach our 2030 goals. Would you support this and how?
Me first? So yeah, this is an idea. There's a guy named Cass Sunstein who wrote it. If you guys want to go read the book, it's called Nudge. And what he talks about, he says, people are herd animals. And so we're all roughly dressed the same, right? Nobody showed up in a Speedo. Nobody, right? Like we all tend to sort of do the same things as people around us, or we get picked on because we look weird. So people tend to want their behaviors to fall in line with other people who they see as their peers. And so one of the ways that California really reduced electric use, that Michigan now does, if you look on your bill, it'll tell you how much your neighbors use for electricity. And every time I see that, I think, well, maybe my neighbors don't watch as much TV as I do, or whatever. But the thought goes through my head of like, how do I compare to my neighbors? And the gas company does it too. So you can, if you have a benchmark for your peers, it's a hugely useful tool for making people think, I wonder why my building uses twice as much electricity or natural gas or whatever as everybody else on this block. Maybe I did the math wrong. Because people aren't perfect, they're not omniscient, and we tend to roll from what we did yesterday to what we do tomorrow, and we have inertia in a lot of our thinking. And so things like this are a great example of ways you can break inertial thinking, you can break inertial behavior, and you can actually get people to up their game by the power of pure example. So it's a great idea. I love it. Yes, and I'd be happy to engage in it.
Thank you. Ms. Lanier?
Yes, thank you for the question, and absolutely. I think that sometimes you don't address what you can't see, and so to be able to have a place where people can go and monitor their own progress and then the progress of others will help to hold people accountable. I think what you probably heard me talk about a lot is education. I think frequently we'll say yes to things and we'll say, yep, we'll do this, and then we don't educate the public on the usage of it. And so I think what will be important to do is not only say yes to having it, but also make sure that we create a structure so that people will know how to use it, so that it can be frequently utilized, and that we are educating people on how they personally can address their own, like as I was mentioning earlier, their own involvement in getting us to carbon neutrality by 2030. Thank you. Great question.
Hi, my name is Colin. I currently reside in the 2nd Ward, and my question was kind of going off of the parking conversation that was had. So we all know that we all struggle with parking, as has been mentioned, but one of the ways that I think could be, well, one of my questions for you all is that how could you go about building a more dense parking area and saving space, and how would you go about using the saved land for better economic or housing development?
Is there a particular location that you're speaking of?
Downtown.
Or not necessarily?
Maybe just in general. I spend a lot of time in downtown where there's a lot of like parking garages and like street level parking.
Okay, so here is the challenge once again. You're asking about, increased parking and density in parking and where it's located, and someone else was asking in this same line about housing and building more housing. And so in lies the problem that we have regularly in government as you're trying to address the concerns of the community. Parking is an extremely important issue to talk about, and creating parking density and shuttling people in is another way of trying to address the transit needs. But then there's also, when you have a large footprint of land, the question becomes, why are we building parking and not putting housing there? And then there have been conversations about trying to do both. Every time you build housing, making sure parking is attached to it. But then that too decreases how much housing you can build. So that's why they're not, I hate to use that they're complex questions or complex solutions, but really they are. And so not every situation is going to be, here's the solution to parking, this is how you do it, and this is where you do it. You really do, what I believe, like I was sharing earlier, you really do need a plan within each area of the city that's going to address the needs that exist within that area of the city. And at the end of the day, not everyone is going to appreciate what the plan is, because people will have opposing views on parking as well as housing and how they're structured within our city, and whether you're paying for it or if it's free, and if the rates go away in the evening or on the weekends. And so you want to make sure that at least when you're creating it, you're not trying to create something blanketly across the entire city when the city is so diverse, but that you're doing something unique to this particular area so that the people who are have businesses there and who reside there can weigh into what it looks like.
Thank you, Ms. Lanier. Mr. LeGrand?
4 ideas off the top of my head. The first is traditionally how we get fuel for vehicles is we go to a gas station. All parking spaces now are potentially, as long as they're reasonably connectable to the infrastructure, EV charging stations. And I've done the math on this. I've actually got some initial work going on bids to do some fast DC charging stations in city parking lots. That can be a revenue generator, and that revenue can then maybe give us more parking ramps and fewer surface parking lots. Surface parking lots I tend to see as sort of blight on the world. The fewer surface parking lots we have, the better, from my perspective. And to answer your question on that too, I happen to know you go to community college. There's a joke that community college essentially, massively overbuilt their parking, and that a lot of that's underutilized. And so there totally could be conversations about places that are very occasional parking users, like downtown churches, and whether they can creatively use those ramps better. The next thing is, it's not that hard to build buildings on stilts. It's not that hard to build piers, which means all of those surface parking lots we see, if they're valuable enough lots and they're in a good enough location, there's no reason we can't just take the airspace and build above them. So that's something I'm going to work on. And finally, Mayor Duggan proposed that we tax land more heavily than we tax buildings. In classic Detroit style, he only wanted this to be a tool to be used in Detroit. I have no idea why, but I'd welcome a conversation about shifting our taxation policies so that we tax underutilized and unutilized properties. One of the reasons, for example, that the building on the corner of Fountain and Division has been sitting there forever, derelict and unused, is because the guy who bought it for $300,000. His taxes are virtually zero. He's waiting to win the lottery and have somebody come along and give him a lot of money for the building. If his tax rate on leaving something vacant were a lot higher, you'd incentivize use.
Thank you, Mr. LeGrand. And our last question of the night.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I'm in the 3rd Ward also, and I was wondering if you could share with us what your vision for the river is going to be in the upcoming years.
And Mr. LeGrand, you start.
I'm sorry, me? Yeah.
Yes.
So the river restoration's got a number of cool things about it. I started, honestly, 10 years ago, deeply suspicious of this because I'm not really interested in Grand Rapids being a playground for people who come into the city. I'm interested in Grand Rapids being beneficial for the people who live in the city. And so when there was talk about spending a whole lot of money on river restoration and so that we could have whitewater kayaking, my reaction was, you could have a lot of public restrooms for the amount of money that you want to spend on whitewater kayaking, and that's something that people downtown could actually use. And that's a whole other conversation. We need downtown public restrooms. But I do think that now we're seeing a couple things. One is much better flood control. When I was on the city commission, we came within like 6 inches of the top of all of our flood walls in the city. I don't know if you remember that flood, but unfortunately, we're going to see that climate change means we have a lot more dramatic weather events, and rivers really go up and down. Some of the planning there is really going to dampen those effects, and that's exciting. It's also exciting to see it become a public resource. So a lot of the planning that's going on there really is opening up the riverfront for everyone. And that's exciting because back to the radical egalitarian thing, I think the river is like everyone's birthright if they're born in Grand Rapids or they're moved here right if they moved here from somewhere. The river is our most beautiful chunk of real estate, and everyone should have an access to it.
Ms. Lanier.
Thank you for that question. When I was running for office for the 3rd Ward Commission seat, many of my neighbors talked about wanting vibrant business districts in their neighborhoods. And what they frequently talked about was all of the resources that were allocated to downtown. And that was even a question we talked about today. And so as a result, I worked on the expansion of our Madison Square Corridor Improvement Authority, expanding it across 6 business districts, which is now called Southtown. And the reason that was important is because it was addressing a need that people talked about. This river and all of the other downtown projects is what I'm hearing about now as I'm running for mayor. People are very concerned that the city addresses all of the needs of downtown at the expense of what's happening in the neighborhoods. And what I also know is that there are people in our community who do not feel as though downtown is for them. They don't frequent downtown. The parking issue that we've been talking about is attributed to them sometimes not going downtown. They don't feel safe downtown. And so as it relates to the river restoration, I'm happy that the project is happening, but it cannot be at the expense of investing in our neighborhoods. The public museum is doing their project really well. The city, when we started the river restoration, is we did a equitable restoration plan so that we can have the voices of people who aren't frequently represented in the projects downtown to have a voice in what it is structured like. And so that too has helped that project to me to be a project that I think we can all embrace. And then, as I've been mentioning before, we're going to have to educate people. We're going to have to make sure it's attractive for people to access it, because it's one thing to say that it's for everyone, but it's a whole nother thing to make sure that everyone can get there.
Thank you, Ms. Lanier. And that concludes our time for public questions. We will now move. Don't get too excited. We have still closing statements. Since Ms. Lanier started us off with opening statements, Mr. LeGrand, you can start us off with closing statements. You have 3 minutes each.
So thank you, all of you who stayed through essentially the length of the movie to talk about the city of Grand Rapids. When I came up here, I was really hoping that we were going to get to sit down and not have to stand in front of podiums for 2 hours, but there it is. So I am excited about the Grand Rapids and what it can become in the next decade. And I think that Grand Rapids can become a national model and do really transformative work in a number of areas. I think we can do transformative work in renewable energy investment. I think we can do transformative work in how we do justice and policing in this city. And I think we can do transformative work in housing and how we help the unhoused. I think that now that doesn't just matter for us. It also matters for the rest of the country. Because if we can be an example and a model for how to do this, states copy other states, cities copy other cities. So I think that we are in a great position right now to look at ourselves as potentially being able to show other people how it's done. And I think we can do that. I think that we have the talent in this community, we have the energy, we have the vision. I meet people every day who are really committed to this city and excited to do work to make it better. So thank you all in advance for the work that I hope that you will all do. I sometimes say that when I'm at doors, one of the things people say is, what are you going to do for me? And I always say, that's the wrong question. The right question is, what are we going to do together? So I hope that together we can make Grand Rapids an amazing city in the next roughly decade, the next 8 years. We have term limits, in case you didn't know, which is why Mayor Bliss, who is endorsing me, is not running for re-election. So I'm proud of the endorsements I have. I'm proud of the fact that both living mayors have endorsed me, that all the environmental groups have endorsed me, that a number of, well, you can go on the website and look at all the organizations and groups that have endorsed me. And those groups are concerned about the same things that I'm concerned about. They're concerned about justice. They're concerned about housing in this community. They're concerned about safety in our community. And they're concerned that we make Grand Rapids a better place for everyone to live in. We are in the people business. We're not in the car business. We're not in the corporation business. We're in the people business. And the test of whether or not we do work well together is going to be whether we are a city on a hill, whether we are a national model that other people are looking at to copy. So I'm proud of the work that I've done in the past. I think I've told you that I did some really transformative work on justice issues at the state, and I'm not going to be done advocating on justice issues at the state level. I'm excited to advocate at the state level on the housing fixes that we're going to need, because a lot of these things are going to need to be worked on at more than one level of government. But I'm excited, more than I'm proud of the work I've done in the past, I'm excited about the possibilities of the work we can do together in the future. So again, thank you all.
Thank you. Ms. Lanier?
Thank you all for being here this evening. Thank you again for moderating, and thank you to Rep. LeGrand for being here this evening. I want to start off with a few educational pieces. I'm not a teacher, but I always tell my kids I'm their first teacher, so I'm always trying to educate. This is a very busy election season. This is the first year the mayoral race is on an even year ballot. And so part of what we're doing is our campaign is educating voters to make sure that they flip their ballot over to the nonpartisan section to vote in this race. None of their straight party ticket voting will reach this office, and that's how a lot of people vote in the presidential election. And so we want to make sure that we're educating voters for that and to flip the ballot over, because they won't see this office if they don't. The other thing that we're also trying to help people to understand is that, for me, as I was sharing earlier, this is home for me. And Grand Rapids is an amazing place to live, and we're on some amazing lists to be able to confirm just how great it is to live here. But we're also on some lists that are not so good. And so what you have, my commitment, if I'm elected mayor, is to address some of the issues that we have not addressed in recent years. Mayor Hartwell talked about one of the issues that he's most disappointed that he didn't address were race issues. Mayor Bliss, when she first started, the very first book that she rolled out and toured was City Within the City. And though nothing really happened with that tour and thereafter, these are the issues that I will be trying to work on as mayor, is changing the culture of our city so that every single person who lives here will experience Grand Rapids as an amazing place to live. So addressing all of the issues that we've talked about on the prepared questions and those that you all brought as you stood before us this evening, because these are the issues that impact all of us. And so what you've probably noticed is a few distinctions between us. One of them is I have corporate experience. I have bargaining experience. My commitment in honoring and making sure that I'm finishing every term that I'm elected to. My ability to say that I want to work with others and listen for solutions, I don't have all of the answers. And it's important for us to be able to work with others to create some of those solutions. I think in addition to that is I will focus on the issues that we are all concerned about. We will be fixing those issues together, because as wise as I may be and the experience that I may have, what I know for sure is that I can't do it alone, and I will definitely finish. I will finish what I start. All of the initiatives that we will work on, they will be a passion project for me so that I can address those issues for all of you. So I ask for your vote on Tuesday, November 5th. And if you would like to get involved in my campaign, please visit sunitaformayor.com. We'd love to have you. Thank you so much for being here.
That concludes the debate for tonight. Thank you all so much for coming. There are still voter resources out there, I believe, so make sure to check those out on your way out. Thanks, everyone.